I often tell people that wildlife trafficking is just one component of an overall organized criminal network. And what we're finding more and more, especially as we work in the international realm, is that there are large scale networks that are engaged in wildlife trafficking. And the reason for that is not particularly because they care about particularly trafficking in wildlife. It's just that some of these wildlife and plant products are so lucrative, they compare or sometimes are more lucrative than drug trafficking and other types of trafficking, with lower penalties and lower risk for the traffickers. And we're also seeing drug trafficking. Just recently in the last year, there's been several instances of cocaine stuffed into timber consignments heading to Europe and Asia. We've had multiple instances of liquid cocaine being trafficked within live tropical fish shipments from South America to Europe and to America. So there are a lot of instances where this type of trafficking is interlinked. But not only that, a lot of these traffickers are just they're disconnected from what they're trafficking in. The point is they're making a lot of money. And it's just like any other type of trafficking, whether it's human trafficking, arms trafficking, drug trafficking, or wildlife trafficking. The component doesn't matter as much as what they're trafficking doesn't matter as much as the fact that they're trafficking a commodity that's bringing them a high level of profit. In the case of wildlife and plant trafficking, around the world, wildlife and plant natural resource laws are generally much weaker than drug trafficking laws or other laws. And they use this, where they can traffic in wildlife, rhino horn, for instance, which gram for gram is the same amount as many narcotics. They can traffic in these commodities and many times walk away. Actually, in the United States, we have some pretty stiff penalties for wildlife trafficking specific statutes. For instance, the U.S. Lacey Act for trafficking in wildlife commercially, if there is a certain knowledge component we're able to prove, is punishable criminally up to 5 years in prison and up to $500,000 fine for corporations per violation. And that seems pretty stiff, but in reality, most times those penalties will get whittled down at the judicial level. So although that's the maximum penalty, in most cases, they'll get much less penalty for that because in general, wildlife trafficking is not considered a higher crime in many people's minds. One thing that we do use, and we're routinely using now, especially in the international sphere, is using other federal laws that are applicable to these crimes. And I mentioned these a lot, that many of our timber cases, for instance, that we've developed under the U.S. Lacey Act for plant trafficking, have developed into a larger financial crime investigation or corruption, conspiracy. There's a lot of other statutes that we use in our wildlife trafficking. And many times the wildlife trafficking charges are not even charged in the end. They develop so that we end up charging higher crimes, such as our general smuggling statute. And I think countries should look at their smuggling statute and see specifically what it says. In our case, in the United States, it says any merchandise. So that could be anything from drugs to guns to wildlife, right? So many times your laws allow that for use in this sphere that you may not be thinking about. So we often use smuggling statute, our conspiracy statute, our money laundering statute. So there's a lot of tools in our toolbox sometimes that we're not immediately thinking of. But in many of these cases, when you look at the large scale commercial enterprises, transnational organized crime involved, these are the most appropriate charges. In many cases, we should forget about charging wildlife trafficking crimes and look more specifically at these higher crimes that are involved. It is the most prevalent type of wildlife trafficking. Trafficking, what I call it, is smuggling in plain sight. And this occurs when we have these entities that are engaged in a legal aspect of the trade. For instance, if you take shark fins, what you're going to see is a legal avenue or component to trade in shark fin, for instance. But you're going to see all kinds of schemes and scams to hide and incorporate CITES or other protected species within those shipments. And I'll give you one example. In 2018, we ran an operation in the United States called Operation Illicit Trade. And what it was is it was a focused operation to look at the eel trade from China, trying to intercept the illegal and unreported CITES species in those shipments. So what we did is we took 1 month and we sampled a lot of eel shipments that came into the United States, almost every one actually that came into the United States in 1 month. And we ended up intercepting and seizing 20 40-foot containers of frozen eel meat, about $25 million worth of trade. Each one of these shipments had CITES species, CITES eel within these commodities, which are simply imported under the General Customs Tariff Code as eel, frozen eel. It doesn't tell you what species, they just manifest it in a very plain, vague way. And of course, there's not much focus on inspecting that type of commodity, so it's easily snuck in. But when we genetically sampled these shipments, we found about 45% of our samples came back as CITES species, which were undeclared, and in fact misdeclared. When we demanded the scientific name, they gave us a false one. So just a quick snapshot, 1 month, what appears to be legitimate trade, about $100 million worth of eel trade into the United States every year. In 1 month, we seized $25 million worth of this illegal eel in the targeted operation. Besides my normal day job, I actually am current secretary of the Interpol Wildlife Crime Working Group. And so I'm part of the board for that working group. And I can safely say the Wildlife Crime Working Group is one of the most prolific and effective working groups. There's one on pollution, fisheries crime, and timber trafficking. But we have robust participation in our Wildlife Crime Working Group. We're very effective. We do an annual operation every year. We're able to talk with countries we don't have relationships with because Interpol does, and we're able to send communications and work through Interpol in many instances. But this particular working group gets together several times a year, and we're able to make very effective contacts within these countries. I just give you a recent example of trafficking in Brazil. They caught a Russian national who was smuggling invertebrates and live reptiles out of Brazil. They caught him at the airport, seized the animals. They had to release that individual, but kept his passport, so he was stuck in Brazil. They went before the judge to go get a permanent arrest warrant for this individual, and the judge wasn't taking the case that seriously. They were thinking, well, this is one time this individual came into Brazil, and yeah, they caught him with some reptiles and vertebrates, but it just really wasn't taken that seriously. But the agent was very concerned because there was evidence on the phone that this person was traveling to protected areas and national parks and whatnot. So the Policia Federal Delegado reached out to me and said, do you have any information in the U.S. on this individual? I said, you know what? I looked in our database and I did not find anything. I said, but let me reach out to my contacts. And I reached out to 3 of my contacts in the internet in the Wildlife Crime Working Group. And I soon got back a slew of information from my contacts in New Zealand and in Spain and other parts of Europe that this individual had been detained and wildlife shipments had been seized from them in each of these countries, that New Zealand had a bunch of tracking device information that this individual was collecting in national parks. So we got a whole bunch of information. We're able to get that back to the Delegado in Brazil. That was presented before the judge. And the judge saw that and now saw the broader scope of this individual and what this person does, which is in fact go around the world and collect rare and endangered reptiles around the world. And so it's then issued the arrest warrant, which wouldn't have been possible without that other information. They went out to arrest him, and they found him on a public bus with, again, several hundred illegal reptiles and invertebrates in Brazil, out poaching again, taking these back to his apartment in Brazil. So they arrested him a second time. And just 2 weeks ago, he was sentenced in Brazil to over 13 years in federal prison.